It seems like the Apostle Paul has not been in what was my English class. If he had been, he might have been told off for mixing his metaphors. In his letter to the Corinthians, in this short passage that Caroline read for us, he uses 3 metaphors to describe the church. The first is a field, the second is a building, and the third is a specific building, a temple. Last week we explored the metaphors Jesus used of salt and light to remind ourselves of our calling to be a blessing to others and sharing the good news of God's love and saving grace in the way that we live our lives and who we are as people. This morning I'd like us to explore those 3 metaphors that Paul uses, field, building and temple, just a little, and to continue another theme that we mentioned last week and has already come out in our service this morning, that of rebuilding and restoring. Now, the key verses from this passage for us are verse 9 and verse 16. We are co-workers in God's service, says Paul. You are God's field. You are God's building. And then in verse 16, Paul says, do you not know that you yourselves are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells within you? Firstly, let's look at what Paul meant by you are God's field. And the first thing to notice is that it is God's field. It's not just any field, it is God's field. He's talking to the Corinthians as a community of believers and saying that together they are God's field. You are God's field. As a community of believers, you are God's field here in Errol. What are fields for? We're surrounded by them here. They're for planting and sowing. They're for tilling. They are for planting so that something will grow and so that some kind of harvest can be produced. Whether that's corn, whether it's reeds, whether it is fruit. At the beginning of this year, I invited you to ask God for one word that would give you a focus for what characteristic He wanted to grow in you, or that you want to grow in you over this year. Or perhaps the focus of an aspect of God's character where you'd like to grow in your understanding. Now, I know that a good number of you have already chosen your word, and some have already shared that with me and with 1 or 2 others. If you're staying behind for coffee today, perhaps if you have a word, you would write it on one of these cards that I will leave. There's some here on the communion table, there's some at the side door, and there's some at the main door, and there's pens to write with. You can put your name on the back if you wish to, but you don't have to. We're not going to be displaying these cards, but it will give me an idea of the kind of words that God has given you, and that we can begin to think about how we'll display them without names in a few weeks' time. We might say that these words have been planted in our lives, and now they need to be watered by prayer and by sharing and reflecting and discussing with one another. And for those who wish to, there will be an opportunity every few months to gather together for a short time to chat and encourage one another, and either alone or together to pray for this fruit or harvest to grow in our lives. Now, that exercise is a very personal one. It's about our growth in faith as individual Christians. But it's one that most of you who are willing to share, in that sharing, it will be a blessing to all of us. But in this passage, when Paul says you are God's field, it applies to them, as I said, collectively, as a community and as a body of believers. Collectively, we can see from what Karen shared that God has planted here a ministry to young people in this field. A ministry that I've said was strong before the pandemic and which is now beginning to grow again. And as Karen said, she is grateful, the team are grateful for your prayers. Please remember them, not just every month as we come up to that, but for the young people who come, praying for them regularly in their daily time at school, with what's going on in their families and the challenges that they face, and also for the team, and also that God will send more workers into the harvest field, because that's what we need. And as I've already said, over the next few months, we'll be highlighting the other seeds that have been planted in God's field, the ministries that you're all carrying out because of the seed of faith that is among you. Tomorrow night, as a Kirk session, we're meeting to discuss pastoral care and how we might best provide pastoral care, how we might grow that as a church, given the changing circumstances in which we find ourselves. Secondly, Paul uses the metaphor of a building, and then specifically a temple, to describe the community of faith. Why does the New Testament repeatedly talk of believers as a building or temple? Well, there are many reasons that I could go into, but there's one very simple and practical reason, and it's one that we don't like. Physical buildings can collapse. The devastation we've seen in Turkey and Syria this week serves as a shocking reminder. Church buildings and temples can be destroyed by earthquake, by fire, by flood, and as we know from times of war, by bombs. We discovered during the pandemic that they can be closed and people can be prevented from entering them. They can also be closed because there is not enough money or people to sustain them. Many communities throughout Scotland are seeing their buildings close. You know that. You've seen it happen along the road in Rate and Kilspindie. And it's heartbreaking for those who experience it. The temple in Jerusalem, where countless Jews had made pilgrimage and worshipped for hundreds of years, had been destroyed by the king of Babylon's army at his command during the Babylonian invasion in 586 BC. The temple in Jerusalem, after many years, was rebuilt, and those who were in exile returned to help rebuild it. And it was this second temple that Jesus went to with his parents. It was this second temple that Jesus prophesied would be torn down and destroyed. And less than 20 years after Paul wrote his letter to the Corinthian church, that's exactly what happened when the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Jesus was turning people's attention away from worship and being focused in one location, God's presence being identified with one location. And Paul was emphasizing this too, because the first Christians met together in one another's homes to worship and break bread. All over Scotland, Christian communities, churches that have worshipped for hundreds of years in buildings, are having to reimagine how they are church in a different scenario, in a different situation that we're finding ourselves in. Some without a building, some having to think about new ways to ensure that their building remains. The key thing to remember, though, is you are God's building. Paul says you are God's temple. God's presence and his Spirit is with you and among you. As a community of faith, here in this place, you are God's building. Not just any building, remember, God's building. You in the biblical text, as I've said, in the plural form. So all of you here, and those who are not here but who regularly worship with us, are part of this community of faith, part of God's building. And you're not just a group of people who have decided that this is where you would like to worship, although that may be the case. Being God's building means much more than that. So we have to ask ourselves, what purpose does a building have? In its most basic form, it's a place of shelter. We, of course, make more of it than that and are privileged to make more of it than that. We associate it with the events that take place in it, with the experiences that we have had in it, with our identity as a community, as a body of believers. For us to be God's building, we as a group of believers are to be a people who shelter others, who welcome others, and who give them a group of people with whom to identify and among whom they can belong. A community, a family of faith, where we learn to love one another, to care for one another, to share life with one another. Now, I want to make it clear in saying this today, when I'm talking about buildings and buildings closing, I'm not saying anything about what might or might not happen here. We know that the Presbytery plan has said we are okay just now, but that plan will be reviewed. And it is important that we prepare ourselves for the reality of what is being faced across the country. I have not been with you for very long, but what I see is a community of believers who care for one another and who are providing an umbrella of care for others. You pray for one another and for your community. You share the ups and downs of life together. You welcome all who come. You are God's building. You are God's workmanship. You have come to faith and you are growing in faith. The pandemic may have caused some things to die or for growth to be stunted in some way, but as I mentioned last week, it is time for strengthening what remains and for seeking God for what is to be built and restored. When Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, he was writing to a community of believers he described as immature. He described them as mere infants because they were not displaying the kind of behaviour or character that would have been formed in them if they had been mature. It sounds as though he was expecting them to be further on than they were. And the evidence he cites is the quarrels and jealousy he's heard is going on among them. They've lost their way. They've fallen into the trap of comparing Paul, whose ministry brought them to faith and established them as a church, with Apollos, whose ministry provided the conditions for them to grow and develop in their faith and mission. The believers in the church in Corinth had their favourites and were in danger of splitting the church because they were making a big thing of the personalities who had led them. Paul was having none of it. He's very clear. Neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. Paul understands that even the most faithful, skilled, diligent worker, when it comes to the kingdom work, will not necessarily be successful. And if they are, it's only by the grace of God and the work of the Holy Spirit. Psalm 127 in the first verse tells us, unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labour in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. The Corinthians had become worldly and unspiritual. They were putting too much emphasis on who had been leading them. Their focus was meant to be on God, the master builder. Paul tells them and emphasizes again that he and Apollos are simply co-workers. There is no competition between them. They are united in their purpose of serving God with the task they've been given. Their work is important. They have different tasks and skills for the common good, but there's no hierarchy and there's no one-upmanship between them. The believers must ensure that they do not put the structure of God's building in danger by engaging in pitting personalities and ministries against one another. And I'm not just talking about ministers like myself, but anyone who is leading the church in any capacity. And in some senses, we are all leaders in the roles that God has given us to do. I haven't been among you long enough to know whether divisions and quarrels and jealousies are part of your history or your story. But what I can say is that I've honestly not seen or heard any evidence that would lead me to be concerned. On the contrary, what I see is that you've learned in the process of a succession of ministries how to be God's field and God's building. In any case, it's not disagreement or factions that I want to focus on this morning, except to say that it's important to be vigilant, to ensure that nothing like that creeps in to destroy God's work, God's field, God's building, God's temple. Because it's the temple where the presence of God dwells. Paul is saying, take your focus off leadership, because we are of no consequence. Yes, we have work to do, and that work is necessary and needs to be done well. But Paul is pointing out your focus needs to be on God. It is God who's giving the growth. This focus on growth and how it is sustained is important. You are God's field, God's building, God's temple. We keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and pray that the Lord of the harvest will grant growth, will keep us strong and intact, and will cause his presence to be made known among us in increasing measure, whatever the future may hold. Let's keep that in prayer as we go through the next few days and weeks and months. Amen.